Hi, I'm Rhys Coleman, Waterways and Wetlands Research Manager at Melbourne Water in the Applied Research team, and I'm super pleased to announce Melbourne Streams. It's a seminar series that will start with a talk a day over the next 2 to 3 weeks for the crews, the Waterways and Land crews, during stage 4 restrictions of COVID. And the topics that we'll present over the next 2 to 3 weeks have been based on those voted for by the crews. So first up, we have Dr. Kathy Russell from the University of Melbourne, and she's part of our Melbourne Waterways Research to Practice partnership with the University of Melbourne. Kathy is a fluvial geomorphologist working on the impacts of urbanisation on physical form and function. Her research interests include sediment supply and transport in urban streams, sediment pollution produced by construction areas, predicting channel adjustment to urban conditions, and looking at the opportunities for managing physical form in urban areas by promoting natural stream adjustment processes and providing opportunities for interactions with floodplains. In her talk today, 2 main objectives are to understand what shapes physical form in urban streams and how the catchment influences that, such as through flows, stream flows, or sediment supply, and also to understand how geomorphic principles can be applied for effective river management. After the talk, which goes for about half an hour, Kathy provides her email address. So if you have any technical questions about what you've heard, then feel free to contact Kathy directly. Otherwise, if you have any questions about this seminar series or the Waterways and Wetlands Research Program in general, then feel free to contact myself, rhys.coleman@melbournewater.com.au, or Slobodanka slobodanka.stojkovic@melbournewater.com.au, who's also in the Waterways and Wetlands Research team. Send us an email and we'll help you with other questions you might have. Anyway, we hope you really enjoy this first presentation, and we look forward to sharing more over the weeks to come. Thanks.
Hi, and welcome to this short training video on the fundamentals of physical form and stream management. We're going to be focusing on how we can work with and not against river behaviour. I'm Kathy Russell. I'm a research fellow with the Waterway Ecosystem Research Group at the University of Melbourne. And I just wanted to acknowledge Jeff Beats and Desmond Anyam, who I've adopted some of their material for this presentation, and especially Jeff, who set up geomorphology fundamentals training courses for Melbourne Water over the last couple of years. So this is a very condensed version of that, where we will just try to focus on a high-level understanding of geomorphic river behaviour and how we can use geomorphic principles to better manage rivers. So objectives today are firstly to understand how stream physical form is shaped by catchment inputs, and secondly to understand how geomorphic principles can be applied to river management. In Melbourne Water's Healthy Waterway strategy, physical form is talked about as the degree of geomorphic naturalness combined with the likelihood of erosion along a waterway's bed and banks. And when we talk about geomorphic naturalness or geomorphology, it refers to the form of the river, so the physical shape, what it looks like now, and the processes that shape it. And we need to understand both to understand the physical form of streams. So, under traditional engineering approaches to river management, we used to, and we still sometimes do, try to design and build a stable channel form that is not going to erode, that's not going to move. Erosion was bad. And we wanted to maintain a hydraulically efficient channel for flood protection. Concrete channels did this really well. Over the last 30 years or so, we've really moved away from using concrete in streams, but we're still using interventions like large rock and like designing our constructed waterways in a way that uses traditional engineering principles to maximize stability and minimize risk that's going to move. What we really want to do is move towards more of a geomorphic river management approach. So where we work with natural processes of the catchment and the stream to reach a sustainable channel form that is not entirely stable, but stable enough in the long term and sustainable and lower maintenance. I want to understand that erosion is a natural process and it can be an important self-repair mechanism for streams. And we want to recognise that diversity and complexity are king, and we should be preserving them and making sure we enhance them in streams. And so we're moving away from thinking about conquering our rivers. And I love this sign on the main Yarra Trail that Jeff took a picture of about 5 years ago, talking about beaching the Yarra's banks with bluestone and widening and dredging the channel. And this sign was actually removed shortly after he took the photo, which is a good sign that we're moving away from thinking about conquering rivers and towards trying to preserve geomorphically sustainable, healthy, complex rivers that sustain a whole range of stream values. Some key geomorphic ideas that we'll go through today. Healthy rivers are dynamic and self-adjusting. Rivers respond to change in predictable ways. Rivers are unique, but when you change catchment inputs, you can predict what they're going to do. And river values depend on sustainable physical form. So having a stream that is in good geomorphic condition is going to sustain ecological values and social values. So firstly, healthy rivers are dynamic. There are some really good examples here of highly dynamic rivers that have migrated across broad floodplains. Either these migrating sinuous rivers on the left, which is a lowland river in Victoria, and on the right is the Mississippi River. And you can see both in the mapping of the Mississippi and in the topographic detail of that floodplain there, how much these channels have migrated over history. We see the same thing with braided rivers, very highly dynamic behaviour. They move around a lot, they rework themselves. And we want to retain that behaviour. And if you try to control that behaviour, then you're really committing and locking yourself into very intensive river management, because if you try to control it somewhere, odds are that it will break out or do something that you haven't controlled for somewhere else. So rivers are a product of their inputs and their boundary conditions. The inputs, the main inputs from the catchment to a river are the flow and the sediment supply. And that sediment supply includes coarse material like gravels and coarser materials and suspended sediment. And those inputs then interact with the boundary conditions of the river valley. So the slope, shape, topography of the valley, the bed and bank materials, so the geology of the river corridor, and the riparian vegetation condition. And together they form all of the aspects of the channel form, the cross-sectional geometry, the slope, and the plan form, or the shape, the bird's eye view shape of that river. And so these can interact in really complex ways and produce a huge range of channel forms. And all rivers are unique, but they all have a similar set of processes that are going on. And so you can, and they all respond first and foremost to these driving variables of inflow and sediment supply. And so when those inputs from the catchment are changed, you can predict or understand something about what's going to change in the river. We talk about healthy streams having dynamic equilibrium. And these are streams that over the short term, they might exhibit dynamic behaviour within a certain tolerance. But over the long term, they are relatively stable and they stay within that tolerance, and they might erode a bit, they might have a bit of deposition, but they generally stay the same. And these streams, they're able to do that because they self-adjust to absorb small changes in inputs, like floods or like spikes in sediment supply from a landslide. And we often think of this equilibrium in terms of a balance or a scale. So this is a nice little conceptual model which describes the balance between, on one side, the stream energy available, which is driven by the flow and the slope of the stream. And on the other side, the bed sediment material, which is able to dissipate that energy. So the sediment supply and the sediment size. When any of those things change, this balance can be put out of alignment, and the stream will respond by either eroding or depositing sediment, and then we'll try to bring it back into balance. So these are these erosion and sedimentation adjustments and negative feedback mechanisms, which bring that stream back into its equilibrium. Here's a nice example of Dobson's Creek in eastern Melbourne, which is a stream that has enhanced flow regimes from its urban catchment. So it has increased flow, but it is still relatively stable over the long term. And you can see here there's a spot of localized erosion, and that bank erosion has liberated a whole lot of coarse sediment. So because these banks have a lot of cobbles and larger particles in them, when they erode, they provide that material into the channel, and then that material is able to dissipate flow energy and provide a buffer to those increased flow regimes. In gravel bed and cobble bed streams, we can see this kind of self-sorting sediment behaviour, which is another way that streams self-adjust. So if you have a stream bed which has a range of particle sizes in it, and you increase the flow, that flow might be able to transport some of the finer particle sizes, but not the coarser ones. And so it will selectively erode and transport the finer particles from the bed surface, and then the coarser particles will stay and they'll settle together, and they'll form an armoring layer over the finer material underneath. And so in that way, the sediment size side of this scale gets coarser without really losing much of that material, or without really having to change the type of material that's there. We can also get these structural armoring of pebbles, where they tend to, because of the currents in the flow, they tend to stack up one on top of the other and form these tiling structures, where it's much harder then for the flow to pick out one of those pebbles and transport it. So they all kind of protect each other. Now, some streams are more resilient than others, so some will be more prone to getting out of balance. So more resilient streams are streams that have coarser bed material. So a boulder bed stream requires a huge increase in flow in order to make a significant difference to how much those boulders move. A bedrock stream is a stream that's cut into the underlying rock, and that's very stable, and it's going to require a huge amount of flow change and a huge amount of time to make any difference to the morphology of that. And cohesive clays can be very resilient to increased flows as well. Even though they're very fine particles, they have strong electrostatic charges in them, which tend to hold them together. But some streams are more susceptible than others to erosion. And an example of this is dispersive soils. So as opposed to cohesive clays, dispersive clays are clays which have a high sodium content, and when they get wet, they tend to just fall apart. They, their structure is completely, they just blow themselves apart. And we know this is a problem in some areas of Melbourne where soils have been disturbed by construction, particularly in the north. And as soon as the subsoils are disturbed, erosion can happen very quickly, and that material that's provided into waterways, it stays suspended and has impacts for a long distance downstream. Sandbed streams are also really susceptible to erosion because it has very fine particles that are able to be moved in low flows and that are not cohesive. So if we go back to our balance between flow energy and sediment supply, yes, we know that different streams will react differently, but in general, our responses, if we have too much flow, we will get an erosional response. And if we have too much sediment supply or not enough flow for the sediment supply, then we'll get sedimentation. And some examples of when we would see streams out of balance. If we have too much flow or not enough sediment, we'll get erosion, and that can happen downstream of dams, because dams interrupt sediment supply to downstream reaches, and then downstream you have a whole, especially if those dams still pass the flow, and that flow is then clear water. It doesn't contain any sediment supply, so that water will then pick up more sediment as it dissipates its energy. Urban streams tend to have highly enhanced and enlarged flow regimes. They have, due to the coverage of surfaces with impervious materials like concrete and asphalt, have highly increased runoff, usually highly increased flow volumes in streams, and highly increased peak flows and flashiness. And those streams on the right are streams which are subject to erosion due to urban flows. And when we have too much sediment or not enough flow, we get sedimentation. And we see that in estuaries and wetlands and lakes, which are naturally they're naturally depositional environments. But then if you get enhanced sediment supply from the catchment, it's all going to end up in those areas. And so, for example, estuaries with urban catchments can be very susceptible to sedimentation. You can get sedimentation downstream of construction areas, which provide huge amounts of sediment, and you get it in urban stormwater assets, which are designed to capture that material. And you can see sedimentation downstream of eroding streams, where that material that's been eroded reaches a lower energy part of the stream and then starts to deposit. This is an example of stream response to urban flow regimes here in Mullumbullen Creek. So you get huge changes in the morphology of these streams. They tend to incise and enlarge, so they'll get deeper and wider. You'll get eroding banks. Because they've eroded and incised, you lose a lot of the in-stream complexity and diversity, like the bars and benches, wood, bed load sediment. And so those features are not able to then provide stream values. So geomorphic change is predictable to a certain extent. Again, all streams are different, but generally we see predictable patterns that are repeated in many different types of streams. And so we can think about a channel evolution model that breaks down these evolutionary patterns of streams into a series of stages. So here's an example. We have stage 1, which is a dynamic equilibrium stream, might have minor adjustments, but is generally stable. Stage 2, if that stream is disturbed in some way, either directly disturbed or due to change in the catchment, then in stage 3, it is likely to start deepening. So usually, and this is true for most streams around Melbourne, they will start to incise into their beds. That will be the first erosional response that we see. Then as they deepen, they destabilise the banks, undercut the banks fall in, and so the streams start to widen as they deepen. And then once that erosion has progressed enough and it has progressed upstream, and so the upstream areas are now providing sediment to our reach, it'll keep widening, but it'll start to fill up with sediment, and that sediment will be reworked and possibly organised into in-channel features like bars and benches. And we should eventually get a stabilising and narrowing of an inset channel, which then becomes a new equilibrium channel. Now, we also recognise that physical form supports stream values. And so it's really important to have sustainable physical form to support, so directly support some social values through aesthetics and recreation, for example. And it also supports ecological values through things like habitat, providing different types of habitat, complexity of habitat in the stream, substrates that are really important for bugs and fish. And so that has intrinsic importance, but then it also has importance for social values and recreation as well. So that starts to get at this question of why we want to take a geomorphic approach. So we want to retain those stream values that benefit society. But as well as that, we also can hope to save money by using a more sustainable geomorphic approach. Traditional stream engineering is incredibly expensive. Concrete lining, but also any rock lining, constructed waterways have huge costs per kilometre. And so if we can encourage the stream to retain its function and its ability to self-adjust, we can reduce construction costs and also hopefully reduce maintenance, because as soon as you construct something that stabilises the stream, then you're committing to having to maintain that. So this final section will be about how to work with river behaviour in our stream management. We want to do a couple of things. We want to retain our river's ability to self-adjust. We want to foster complexity so we can sustain all those stream values. We need to consider and work with the trajectory of our streams, understanding what they're likely to do next. We want to address the root causes, not just patch up the symptoms. And we need to consider whether intervention is necessary at all. In some cases, it definitely will be, especially in highly urban environments where our development and our infrastructure is encroaching on streams and their self-adjustment conflicts with our use of those stream corridors. But there'll be some cases where it is better to do nothing if, or if we can get to these streams at the planning stage to set back our infrastructure and make sure that we won't have to intervene as much. So we need to retain the ability of our rivers to self-adjust. And for that, they need space. And the amount of space they need is very dependent on how dynamic they are in the first place. So this requires a really good understanding of the historical migration of these channels, of how they're likely to adjust to changes in inputs and just how they're likely to adjust over time. And we can actually map this and predict this quite well. And this has been a planning tool in some parts of the US for almost 20 years, especially on the West Coast, where the hazards associated with stream channel migration have been recognised for a long time. And so they have this planning approach where they map the likely hazard zones of channel migration and protects them from development. We also want to protect our coarse sediment supply. So we know that the coarse sediment supply is key to the river's ability to self-adjust and self-repair. So if you have a river where for some reason you have erosion and you lose all that in-channel complexity and you lose your substrates, you need something coming in to rebuild those as it recovers. So think about in the catchment where the sediment's coming from, or locally if there's coarse sediment in the stream banks, making sure that that is able to get back into the river. And avoiding widespread channel hardening is necessary to allow the stream to self-adjust, to erode its banks in ways that will allow it to recover. We want to foster complexity. So we want complexity in our stream for different types of habitat. And for that, we need sediment supply, we need coarse sediment supply so that we can build up and maintain in-channel features. And we need large wood supply and riparian vegetation. So that riparian vegetation can have its own structural impact, and it can also be the thing that replenishes and supplies large wood to the channel. And that large wood in the channel is incredibly valuable because it creates these turbulent flow structures, scour holes. It creates really complex hydraulic environments for biota. We do want to avoid wholesale erosion, for example, channel incision. So this is an example of an incised channel due to urban inflows, which has very little habitat value, very little, its stream values have been highly impacted. And so in some cases where you have catchment change, which can't be fixed at the catchment scale, you might need to intervene in the channel to avoid this wholesale channel incision. And we should be, if we do need to design something structural, then complexity should be considered in that design. And for example, low-tech structures can be much better than high-tech, highly engineered designed structures. And structures which are not planned to be in place or stable in the long term, but which are planned to almost be a seeding structure for complexity that will then be replaced by long-term sustainable behaviour in the river. We need to consider trajectory in our management responses. So taking the example again of channel incision, we know that in this channel evolution model that streams are likely to deepen before they widen. So if we catch a stream when it's still deepening, we have an opportunity to arrest that channel incision before it goes too much further. So at that stage, grade control structures might be highly appropriate to arrest the deepening. But then we need to understand that widening is an important part of the recovery process. So if your channel has deepened, chances are it's going to widen to some extent. And that widening, as it propagates upstream, will supply more sediment and will allow our stream to recover. So when we do things like grade control, we want to be thinking about getting this on its trajectory towards recovery, but not controlling everything. We want to address the root causes of problems like erosion, not just patch the symptoms. Think of an example that you have a wet patch on your floor, and you could address that by putting down a towel or a bucket. But you're probably better off looking for the leak that is causing that wet patch and fixing the leak. Otherwise, you're just going to have to keep on patching the symptoms forever. So, and when we look for these root causes, they're probably not going to be at the same scale that we see the symptoms. So if our attention is drawn to a localized erosion issue, then we need to zoom out a bit and take a bit of a helicopter view of what's happening in the rest of the river. Is this erosion a localized issue? And what's happening in the catchment that's actually driving this? So this example, it looks like a localized erosion issue. But if you look at the catchment, it's a suburban catchment. And so this is likely caused by urban flow regimes. And if you walked a reach of this channel, you'd see many other examples of erosion. And so you would be better here to look at interventions which can address the urban flow regime and stop those erosive flows from getting into the channel than to patch this section of erosion. And where you don't address the root causes, but you patch just a section, it can be highly appropriate sometimes if you're just trying to protect a key piece of infrastructure, but it can also translate those problems downstream. Finally, we want to consider when to act. Doing nothing and monitoring and re-evaluating geomorphic problems should always be on the table. That said, there will definitely be situations where you do need to do something structural, and that should be a risk assessment process. So if we think about risk, it is likelihood versus likelihood times consequence. And so the likelihood is all about how susceptible is this stream to erosion. If you remember, if it's a bedrock stream or a boulder bed stream, it's probably not susceptible to erosion. But if it's a sand bed stream or a gravel bed stream, then it may be highly susceptible. And then the second part of that equation is what is at risk? So is there key infrastructure or property, or is human safety an issue? And so the more that's at risk, the more likely we are to need to go and do structural interventions. So you can just see there that in that last picture, then you really need to do something to stop that erosion and protect that structure. But in the middle here, you have some localized erosion and nothing really seems to be at risk there. So that might be more of a monitor and reevaluate situation. So I hope that was useful for you to get an idea about key geomorphic principles of river management and how you might apply those principles. Thank you, and please feel free to email me with any questions about this or if you want any further information. Thanks.